think I'll at least start by introducing our guest while everyone is getting settled. Please help yourself to more goldfish, which are always the international sign for this is a humanities center event, as well as wine and sparkling water, which we've moved up to the mantel. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Peter Waterhouse, a translator, scholar, writer, poet, memoirist, and force field. The energy that he's created around himself at the VERSATORIUM in Vienna is something that we are about to witness here at Harvard, and it's not a moment too soon. He was here last spring, sharing with us some of the translations and reimagined versions that he has created of the poetry of Charles Bernstein and Rosemary Waldrop. He and his colleagues in the VERSATORIUM created this book of Charles Bernstein's work, Die Dichte und Übersetzen, but hiding behind that very modest title, Poems and Translations, is a collection of texts that do to the German language what Charles Bernstein's work does to the English language. In Peter Waterhouse's hands, linguistic energies are palpable, so real that it feels sometimes that we can reach out and touch them. Peter Waterhouse has translated a number of major figures working in Italian and in English, about whom he will speak today. And he and his Viennese colleagues have also turned their attention to the contemporary Georgian avant-garde. Together, they have made translation into an act of community, going beyond the two-way relationship between poet and translator toward a plurality of voices, rather than any form of duality. His own creative work is represented in English translation in the book Language, Death, Night, Outside, published by Burning Deck, volume translated by Rosemary Waldrop in 2009. It includes a mix of texts that are as much about language and thought as about the cities, travels, and histories that are its subject. And his writings in German include several books. Please come in, there are more seats right on this side. Today's seminar is the first in a week-long series here at Harvard, to be followed by workshops on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 5 o'clock in the Woodberry Poetry Room. But we are meeting in a separate venue today, in part to mark the connection to multiple sources of funding for this event, to which we're very grateful. We are sponsored by the Elson Fund, the Program in General Education, the Woodberry Poetry Room, represented by the video equipment that is now happening, and by Christina Davis, who's bringing in more chairs, and our own Rethinking Translation Seminar, which I, Stephanie Sandler, and Sandra Nadoff co-chair for the Mahindra Humanities Center. Warm thanks to all, and especially a warm welcome to Peter Waterhouse.
Good evening and welcome to this seminar. Thank you for your very kind introduction. You may have already said the most important things about the project. I will try to add a few further thoughts. It is again a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure when I was here in April. But this time I found especially attractive the title of today's meeting, or of today's class or program, the rethinking of translation, or rethinking translation, especially the ing part of it, the ing. Because maybe there is only thinking and no such thing as thought, but only the movement. I think we tried to address this idea of movement and thinking in the title of the Bernstein production, in English and German translations, Gedichte und Übersetzen. Übersetzen could be a verb, could be a noun too. But even if it is, please have a seat here. This is available.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
You're not interrupting. Übersetzen, as I said, could be a verb, but even if it is a verb, then in German it is the infinitive form of the verb, and that strikes me as different from the continuous form in translating. So the infinitive form, you don't really know when it is happening. If it is infinitive, is it actually happening now? Is the movement happening now or not? Or even if it is infinitive, has it stopped or will it begin? Whereas the English translating, I reckon, is happening now. So the English form, I think, is the better form. We've been reading Hannah Arendt and her remarks on thought and thinking, and her judgment that there's no such thing as a thought, only thinking. Thought is too close to a result, and results don't result from thinking, apparently. So I will try to give you an impression of what we are doing in Vienna in this VERSATORIUM project. And if you have any remarks or questions, just interrupt me anytime. If you agree or if you disagree, I'm happy to be interrupted all the time.
Can everyone hear okay? Is it...
Am I
I saw
loud
a
enough?
fan back there that,
Yeah. So our way of rethinking translation happens, I think, by not only analyzing poems and actually translating poems, but by searching for theoretical reading. And it happens that the most interesting texts and books, the most interesting influences for us come from writers who don't actually write about translating. Maybe with one exception, with a kind of exception, in the person of Walter Benjamin, who apparently did write about translation, especially in the introduction to the Baudelaire translation. The influences we have come across and we are studying, hopefully with no results for our translations, or no proper results. Maybe studying them to get away from results. These readings are focused at the moment on Hannah Arendt sometimes, especially the book Was ist Politik? What is Politics? I don't think that has been translated into English. I think she wrote that in German. she's of special interest for us because she began writing and thinking in German, but then switched or had to switch to English or American English. And her first big book on totalitarianism was, it's 1,000 pages, I think. It was written in English, which was not her mother language, mother tongue at that time. And then she translated it herself into German. So that is of special interest for us. Also, because of the changes one can find in the English and the German versions. But also this little book on politics is of great interest, and Vita Activa as well. What she says about the ability to begin. Her remarks on the human ability to begin, that is not to deduce, not to think consecutively, if-then constructions. These remarks are not aimed at, they're not about translating, not at all, but we find them very useful to think about or rethink translation. So Hannah Arendt is one of the influences. And of course, maybe I should say Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Viennese philosopher, if that is the correct description. Maybe the philosopher who was trying to bring philosophy to an end and to solve all problems. Viennese are very radical. Our atelier, which we've been using for 12 months now, is right beside the Wittgenstein house in the 3rd district. So when we look out of the windows of this little atelier, we see the building which Ludwig Wittgenstein, together with an architect, Engelmann, I think is his name, designed in the, if I remember correctly, 1920s. So Wittgenstein is our neighbor. But also his philosophical investigations, they are also our neighbors. What we also try to study, or will study, we haven't done it extensively yet, is Michael Bachtin. And I won't say much about him because it... and also a Japanese political scientist whose name is Masao Maruyama. I think he has been translated into English. And there's one book of his which is very interesting for translation, although he does not talk about translation at all, is Denken in Japan, thinking, again this is could be a verb, Denken in Japan, thinking in Japan. And there's one essay in this book, which I've read several times, Was man ist und was man tut, what one is and what one does, where we find the distinction between a kind of result, what one is, and a different condition, what one does, which does not end up in a result. I'm just mentioning these influences so that you can get an idea of how we are working in this Versatorium project. Walter Benjamin, he's probably the most famous philosopher, again, if he is one, who wrote about translating, especially well known as The Task of the Translator, I think is the English title. Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers. He seems to be writing about translating, but I get the impression that what he's writing in that essay can hardly be applied to his own translations. The Baudelaire translations. It is the introduction to that Baudelaire translation. It was written as the introduction to that translation in 1920, and I think published in 1923, but hard to apply. Unless you want to consider that in the essay he is writing and thinking about how to put up defenses against meaning. Unless you want to consider that in the essay he is thinking about how to put up defenses against meaning, and in the translation also he is putting up defenses against meaning in these poems. But the defenses he's putting up in the translations, in the Baudelaire translations, are such which are not actually mentioned in the essay. In the essay he talks about various things, but also about an interlinear translation as a kind of ideal translation. Interlinear, ideal because if you are truly interlinear, then you are disturbing syntax, even possibly destroying syntax or changing it, and therefore doing something against meaning. In the translations, in the Baudelaire translations, he is not really producing an interlinear version, I think. All the same, he is attacking meaning, I think, in the translations, but in a different way, not by an interlinear translation, but by other means. Quite hard to detect which means, probably or maybe by isolating the words. He seems to be translating word by word, but not interlinear. So that's very strange to translate word by word, but not being interlinear. If you feel you want to say something, yes, please do so.
How did he define interlinear, or how do you define it?
Yeah.
You asked for it, Peter.
Yeah. I would think now I'm saying something difficult. Meaning by meaning, literal meaning. So, translating tree into Baum. That would be an interlinear version. Yes. Keeping in mind the meaning of the word, not necessarily keeping in mind the meaning of the sentence. That's what he's doing in the Baudelaire translation. Not paying too much respect to the sentence, but well, we're not going into Benjamin at the moment. Maybe in this week, if you like, but we'll be. I think we'll be getting closer to language poetry, American poetry, and not Baudelaire. And there's one other major influence, if I may say so. Maybe slightly arrogant to say influence, but maybe I should just say one enjoyment we have, a certain enjoyment in Stanley Cavell, or great enjoyment. I did not know his name, I have to say, before I came here in April. I discovered his name and some of his books when I was here in April, simply because I went to a lecture of the Archbishop of Canterbury, not knowing that he was going to speak about Stanley Cavell. I did know the Archbishop of Canterbury, strangely enough, not because I live in Canterbury, but because he writes poems. And therefore I went to this lecture here and was, I greatly enjoyed it, but especially enjoyed the part about the writing of Stanley Cavell and the concept of approaching or not approaching. And therefore I quickly bought this new and unapproachable America, which again says nothing about translation, I think, but actually doesn't talk about translation very much, or maybe doesn't talk about translation at all, but it does observe language and texts under the aspect of translation, because Cavell reads Heidegger and Ludwig Wittgenstein in two languages, in the English translation, but also in the German or Austrian original. Cavell is so very interesting for us because he suggests that one should stop reading, and that interrupting the reading progress is a kind of enjoyment and happiness too. I myself have experienced this book on the New America, as a text where you enjoy not progressing. And I bought it in April. It only has 120 pages, and I haven't read more than, I think, 90 pages. And I'm not sure whether I want to read more, not because I dislike the book, but for the other reason, because I like it so much. And he actually speaks about these moments of stopping the reading and enjoying the place where you are. That is very interesting, I think, for translating. Can you find these moments or points or places where you needn't continue? Most translations which I know, all translations which I know are complete translations. They don't stop. There's no tradition of interrupting the translation project or process. There's no tradition of doing this. It would be considered as incomplete. I think there have been incomplete translations. For instance, Charles Dickens was translated into German in the 19th century in an incomplete way, because there were parts, for instance, in Oliver Twist, where a big city was described, and the German translators at that time did not know what a big city looked like. So, how dirty it could be, how ugly, how smelly, how full of people. So they left out parts which they did not understand, which for us today are quite understandable. But this is not the kind of stopping which Cavell speaks about, of course. So this idea of interrupting the reading is of great interest for us, but also this idea that something cannot be approached. He seems to be talking in this new yet unapproachable America about America, but I think you could almost replace the word America almost by the word art, although he's careful about using the word art. But I think it could almost be replaced because, why? Because the art, the work of art also has, if I can say so, qualities which do not allow approaching. There is something in a work of art which cannot be discovered or found or observed. And therefore cannot be approached. Now, if that is true, that the work of art does not contain solutions which you approach and find, if there's something non-approachable in a text, in a poem, in a novel, whatever, then the translation will have to react to this concept. So let me switch to one example. I think today's meeting has been given the title Alphabetical Translation, is that right?
Which I completely forgot to say.
Which I forgot to advertise.
It now has that title.
Yes, that's why I thought it might be a useful title if we're not sure what it means.
That's the title.
I'll try to give you an example. I think there's no such thing as alphabetical translation. I think it's an invention. Or do you use the term in this country? In Europe, I don't think it's used. In Austria, it's not used, or maybe at least I don't know it. It seems I've invented it, or somebody, or we've invented it. I don't think it is used. So we can't be sure what it actually means. But it has to do with the idea that translation does not have to, or that translation should not feel confident to merely translate meaning. And therefore should pay attention to the alphabet or to the individual letters, because the individual alphabetical letter does not contain meaning? I wonder. The letter A, it may contain some kind of information, but probably not meaning. Although this is not, it can't be completely correct because each letter has a long history. And of course, alpha means something if you go back very far, and the beta in Hebrew means something, and so on. Yes, beta I think means house, for instance.
Just a quick question. So is this alphabetical translation the task of translation, so to say? You know, the kind of compromise, the Aufgabe, this giving up in terms of task, because it doesn't, it's impossible to translate the meaning, so you have to concern, on alphabetical, because the other one you can try and translate.
I think it's a kind of alternative.
Yeah.
If you cannot avoid meaning. Meaning is there all the time. But if you want to distinguish another possibility, then alphabetical translation could be an alternative. And I'll give a few examples, which may be convincing or not, especially from Waldrop and Charles Bernstein. But before I talk about those two, I'd like to give an example of non-alphabetical translation, which I think is the traditional approach. And I'm trying to introduce a non-approach, if there is such a thing. For instance, this Kafka translation by Schocken Books, which there must be new translations now, of course, various American translations. But this I bought when I was a student at USC. I did actually study in this country, in Los Angeles, and I found this slip of paper in here with saying USC, University of Southern California. I bought this, the complete stories of Kafka. And if you look at one of his early stories, Beschreibung eines Kampfes, description of a struggle, you can come across this, you come across an example of translation of meaning right in the first sentence. In the first part of the first sentence, which reads, "At about midnight, a few people rose." At about midnight, a few people rose. This in German is gegen 12 Uhr standen schon einige Leute auf. The meaning of the German sentence has been conveyed correctly. There's no question. It's a true, it's a faithful translation. If you put your faith in meaning. If you put your faith in something else, for instance, in letters, then it turns out not to be a faithful translation. Now, if you look at the letters of the German sentence, gegen 12 Uhr standen schon einige Leute auf. There are very interesting elements in this sentence. I won't mention all of them, but one of them is the first word, gegen, which means something like against. In the description of a struggle by Kafka, there is, on the level of the story, I think there is no struggle. At least you don't find two or more people struggling or fighting. Beschreibung eines Kampfes is not only a struggle like somebody struggling to get on a bus. It's a fight. Although I accept the translation description of a struggle, it is also, It could also be a description of a fight or a battle even. If you think of a battle or a fight, then there is no battle in this rather confusing story. Maybe the only moment of struggling or of a kind of opposition is in the very first word, gegen, because gegen means against. And if you accept that gegen expresses an opposition, then gegen 12 Uhr is a kind of opposition against 12 o'clock. The meaning of 12 o'clock, you could even say. The first sentence begins with an absolutely usual expression, at about 12 o'clock, gegen 12 Uhr. But in the context of a struggle, the word gegen has another aspect. It doesn't only mean at about 12 o'clock. It's doing something else. It's struggling with the idea that there is such a thing as 12 o'clock. It's struggling with grammar, one could say. This struggle with grammar is lost if you translate meaning. This is a thesis, yes. The other part of this sentence is even more interesting. Rose, the very elegant English word to rise, to get up, like the sun, getting up from bed like the rising sun, is in German, it's probably more down to earth. Standen schon auf. The schon is lost in this translation. Already. I think there's no already in the English. At about midnight, a few people rose. The German standen auf, if you wanted to translate that more or less literally, alphabetically, it would be stood up. And I would say it's probably necessary to translate it as stood up. Why? Standen schon auf. There's something strange in this very normal expression, standen auf, because standen, the past tense of stehen, of to stand, does not express movement. Stehen, as stand, is being without movement. If you add is it a preposition? I think it's a preposition. Sort of preposition, yeah. Auf.
Or the prefix.
It's a prefix, which in this case is
Separate.
separate, a separate prefix. Let's call it separate prefix, an independent prefix. If you attach that to the word, suddenly you produce movement. So you have a verb which expresses no movement. You attach 3 letters, auf, suddenly movement begins. And I think this is what Kafka, I assume, this is what Kafka was wondering about. How can you change a verb which means stability, no movement at all, by adding a tiny little word, attaching a tiny little word to the word or to the sentence, and suddenly you produce movement. I think this is the kind of struggle what the whole story is about.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
To a German reader of the German, would they find that opening sentence to be unusual in any way, or would it just like kind of roll in their ear as something that they've heard before every day? Or how unusual or interesting would that sentence be to a German speaker?
It's very hard to say. That's quite hard to say. I think it's an extremely ordinary sentence in the sense of Cavell's ordinary language interest, also Wittgenstein's ordinary language philosophy. But it's so ordinary that you needn't say it. So therefore saying it becomes very unusual. To start a narration by saying, towards 12 o'clock, a few people already got up. You're not precise about the time, and you're not precise about the number of people, and it's very anonymous. So what are you actually talking about? Are you talking about anything, or are you thinking about language? I assume the second. So for the German-speaking reader, the sentence is not striking, doesn't strike as unusual. Like in English, at about midnight, a few people rose. I mean, this few people is it's so normal that it's strange. Especially if you continue and find out this is not about these few people at all. And even the midnight is not so very important. Midnight is an interesting translation because in German it's 12 o'clock. So when you read this sentence, you don't know, is it 12 o'clock noon or is it 12 o'clock at the end of the day? Midnight is a kind of, it's not a translation, it's an explanation. It explains. So you understand very quickly what the translator is doing. He's explaining. And therefore he's even inventing meaning to explain. The German Kafka does not want to explain. It's obvious the sentence doesn't want to explain. It's doing something else.
So if Kafka had wanted to say midnight, he could have said midnight.
Oh yes, gegen Mitternacht. And it would have produced more atmosphere, I think. Towards midnight, a few people got up. Well, danger is coming. You could get the impression something's going to happen. Midnight is a dangerous time of the day. Everything is dark and so on. Gegen 12 Uhr, the first impression you get is probably it's around 12 o'clock noon. They're leaving a restaurant or a coffee house. Few people sitting in a coffee house and they get up. So the English midnight is almost switching to a detective story. Although Rose, again, is quite a different case, I think, if people rise. But what I want to say is this standen auf, it could be of no importance if this word only appeared in this position once in the whole text, in these 100 pages. But actually, the word stehen, the past tense form stand, or the plural standen, is highly active. And this, the translator into English did not want to observe, because I think it's a male translator, because he was trying to follow the storyline, but there is no storyline, I think. So he was really struggling, but it was a different struggle than the description of a struggle which Kafka wrote. If you observe stehen in all the combinations which follow, you can't avoid being attracted by that word or focusing on that word, I think. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. on page 2 or 3, already you have two people communicating, a dialogue between two, and they talk about Verstand. Verstand contains the past tense of the word stehen, and it means reason. They also use the word verstehen, which means understand. Now there, in English, you would have an opportunity to take up the standing up at the beginning of the story, understanding. So you have, well, reason could be understanding, yes. Verstand could be understanding. And then you have maybe 10 different combinations where this standing returns, is repeated. Variations of the word to stand. Zum Beispiel, for instance, entstehen. Etwas entsteht. In English, that would be is created, comes into being. And then 10 or 15 pages later, the two who left this établissement at midnight and who walk through Prague, they come to a square, and in the center of the square there is a statue of Karl IV, an emperor, Charles IV, some Austrian emperor. And they stand in front of the statue, and the word statue in German is Standbild. So there it comes again, and the narrator of the story, he's looking at this statue, and he feels unsure while he looks up at the statue. And then he thinks, well, the statue could tumble. I'm feeling rather dizzy looking at this statue. It could fall down any moment. And then, indeed, the statue falls down. The statue, the Standbild, which is standing, it falls down. And there's a very funny moment in this falling, because in German it says, and indeed, the statue fell down, das Standbild fiel, in dem Moment, als mir einfiel. In English, the statue fell down in that moment when I, what is einfiel in German, in English? Yeah, it could be kind of when I remembered, when I had the idea. When I remembered, yes, but that, of course, leads in a quite different... Yes, the meaning is to remember. So this narrator is looking at the statue, and he thinks of his girlfriend. But the German doesn't say think, it says, mir fiel meine Freundin ein. I remembered my girlfriend. And in that moment, the statue falls down. And then the whole story is about standing up, sitting down, standing up, sitting down, all the time. Before somebody says anything, he or she stands up or sits down. So it is a kind of, to use the term which Wittgenstein uses, it is a kind of grammar of the word stehen, or to stand. Or it's making use of the word to stand. Now, if you don't understand, if you don't translate it, following this grammar of the word to stand, then you get into great difficulties in the second part, in the second chapter of this story. Because in chapter 2, as I understand it, the story of the narrator and his friend who at midnight leave some kind of établissement and walk through Prague, the story is about these two men attempting to get to the top of the Laurenziberg, to get up to somewhere. The whole story is about walking through Prague and eventually climbing up this mountain, Laurenziberg, to stand on top of the mountain. But the second chapter actually is not about somebody climbing up a hill, but the second chapter is the hill itself. The text becomes the mountain, and the text itself is able to rise. The text itself stands up. How does it do that? Quite easy. The narrator says, I liked the path leading up the Laurenziberg, so I made it steeper. And when it got too steep, I let the path dip again. So suddenly, the text itself is producing the mountain. Or, in other words, there is no mountain, there is the struggle with the text. But if you do not follow this grammar of standing, then you are retranslating the text into a very traditional narration, I think. So therefore, this idea of ours in the VERSATORIUM Club in Vienna to be attracted by the alphabet, by individual letters, also words, not only letters, of course. So this is one example. What happens if you are too true, too faithful to meaning? I don't know whether it's convincing, but it's something which I constantly have to think about, and the students as well, in the group in Vienna. Wittgenstein is so very interesting for us because, as Hannah Arendt, he was a person who wrote in two languages or thought in two languages and is constantly being read in two languages, English and German. In other translations too, of course, but he was teaching or studying in England, but he was writing in German, and I think he was involved in the translation process. So for a similar reason as Hannah Arendt, Wittgenstein is of great interest for our work, but also, or more than this bilingual aspect, more important are his reflections on meaning, as opposed to something else which he calls Gebrauch or Verwendung, which I think both can be translated into use. Wittgenstein constructs an opposition between the meaning of a word and the use of a word. For instance, in the Kafka narration, one could say, I think, that what Kafka is doing with the word stehen, verstehen, aufstehen, Verstand, etc., could be seen as a kind of grammar of the word stehen, or you could say he is showing the use of the word, Gebrauch, Verwendung. And I think it becomes quite clear that use is indeed something different than meaning, because in stehen, entstehen, verstehen, Standbild, and various other variations of the same word, the meaning of the word is changing. So in use, you don't have a stable, constant meaning. The stability of the meaning of a word is an illusion. I think that is what Wittgenstein is writing about. So again, we find someone pointing away from meaning to something else, which he calls grammar of a word or use of a word. Wittgenstein also describes use as something happening, kind of continuous form like rethinking translation, something happening in a long period of time, whereas meaning is a kind of identity which is attributed to a word. Use is something which unfolds in time, changes and unfolds. Maybe you would be interested in hearing about some examples of this idea of use as opposed to meaning. I have here some photocopies we could look at. Of a poem by Paul Celan, which was translated by Charles Bernstein. But before we look at that, I would like to just say a few remarks on the meaning of the alphabet, the alphabetical order in the poetry of Rosemary Waldrop. Our first big translation in the student group in Vienna was Charles Bernstein, and this is, I don't want to say it's the result because we're trying to avoid results. Actually, this is trying to be no result. We like to call it a salto instead of a result. It's the same word, the salto. Salto in Italian is just jumping. So this is trying to jump, but not trying to conclude the jump by a final result. And we would like readers to work on this book, even change it and do something with it. But now we've switched from reading and discussing and translating Charles Bernstein to the poetry and the essays of Rosemary Waldrop. And maybe one day we will be able to produce a selected translation together in the group. One series of poems we've been I think, talking about for several months now without producing any results. It's very interesting. We are able to discuss poems for a very long time under the aspect of translatability, but nothing happens. So we 25 people sit around a big table, not quite as big as here, and we discuss the poem and the translatability. And maybe after 4 or 5 or 6 hours of discussions, with intervals in between, maybe one word is translated. And we've come to find that very attractive, that nothing is happening. That's what Stanley Cavell is also writing about when he talks about Heidegger and the philosophy of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein writes about leaving everything as it is. The task of philosophy, leaving everything as it is. That's very, very striking for a group of translators, to try to leave everything as it is, if I don't completely understand Wittgenstein in this case. So we've been talking about Lawn of Excluded Middle, a series of poems by Rosemary Waldrop, I think 30 or 25 individual prose poems, don't know the exact number, because I haven't read them completely. Although good translators probably should read, or are required to read from the beginning to the end. In this case, I haven't done that, so I don't know the exact numbers. Let's say 25 prose poems. And I think we haven't yet translated more than 2 or 3 lines. In the title Lawn of Excluded Middle, it's quite clear that the alphabet is of importance, because that N, the letter N in Lawn of Excluded Middle, is something which changes the meaning completely. Like in Stehen auf, the prefix or preposition changes everything. The N in lawn changes the meaning considerably, or maybe it's something else than a change of meaning. The conventional expression, I think, is law of excluded middle. With lawn, you are beginning to talk about a place, probably. The interesting thing about the word lawn, one of the interesting aspects of the word lawn, is that it is probably a German word. So the German person who became an English writer is still attached to her German memory, I think. Well, you can find that in various poems. In this case, lawn goes back to the German word Land. So if you think of lawn of the excluded middle as a German-speaking person, you begin to see or imagine a country of excluded middle. And you get very close to Stanley Cavell's non-approachable place or non-approachable America. In this case, it's not unapproachable but excluded. Quite similar, one could think. I think there will be more to say about this tomorrow, because I'd like to focus on Rosemary Waldrop's poetry tomorrow. But just to give you an idea of this concept of alphabetical meaning, there's quite a funny line in one of the prose poems of this series where Rosemary Waldrop writes, he or she puts her or his foot on a floor. But the word floor is written F-L-A-W, like lawn. So in this instance, you suddenly realize that letters can be floors. But also you realize that floor, the English word floor, written F-L-A-W, floor, the or is a kind of O, especially if you're German. If you're German, you don't have, in standard German, you don't have the sound or. You don't have it. It sounds for a German-speaking person like an O, like in floor, F-L-O-O-R, floor. You think it's an O. Somebody's trying to say O, but he's saying or. In some German dialects, you do have the or. In Austria and in Bavaria, and Rosemary Waldrop was born in Bavaria, you do have the or. People in those regions, if they speak the dialect and they want to say land, they don't say Land, which is High German, Standard German, Land. They say, in Austria too, where I live, they say Lond. So when Rosemary Waldrop hears the English word law, she also hears Lond, mein Land. Even Germany, Deutschland. You can hear Deutschland. In Austria, people, they will not say Deutschland, they will say Deutschland, Land. There's the or. So she's closely listening to letters, more than to meanings, I think. Land. It's really the English. It's like English. Land. It's like lawn. Almost like London. If a German person says it's not London, London. So this is a kind of description of what we are doing in the Versatorium. I don't know whether it becomes clear what we're doing. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
That might be part of the transition to second whom this would always be true. It's very striking that your examples of Kafka and Rosemary Waldrop are people who are bilingual,
Yes.
moving between languages. Does that echo of alternative pronunciations, meanings, etymologies, associations, sounds in the mind of the creating person, does that become part of what you are so interested in translating?
And Peter himself, between languages.
So is it
Yes.
that kind of estrangement? I mean, but maybe, the formalists would say that's true of everybody who writes. It's not just people moving
Yeah.
between languages. But is it unusually accentuated? Is it that the thing which is so fascinating to then try to address in that moment of doing a next translation, a next movement?
Well, Wittgenstein could, in the first moment, be a different example because he's not multilingual, and he didn't translate poetry. But then maybe what you are saying is also true for Wittgenstein because he left Austria, but before that, even when he was living in Austria, when he was an Austrian, he was part of the Habsburg Empire, which was a place where many languages were heard and spoken. It was not this country or this empire was not only a German-speaking country. So maybe his idea of the grammar of a word, the use of a word as opposed to meaning, comes from this experience of different languages. But it didn't make him a translator.
Right.
And I think he avoided... No, I don't think... I think it's a fact that he avoided writing about poetry. He constantly wrote about language, but he did not write about poems. He did express his fascination by poems, for instance, by Georg Trakl. But he did not reflect on what is happening with a word in a poem. What kind of grammar can be found in a poem? What kind of use is being made of a word in a poem? He was always observing use in everyday language, whereas in the poetry of Georg Trakl, you can't say that's everyday language. By the way, an interesting aspect, again, it doesn't have anything to do with translations, apparently. Wittgenstein was appalled by the wealth of his family. It was an extremely rich Viennese family. And he inherited millions of kronen. He was a very, very, very wealthy person. And he gave away all his money, completely. On one occasion, he went to his bank manager and he said, I'm going to give 5 million to various recipients. He even gave money during the First World War to a factory producing cannons. So he gave his money to build weapons during the war. But he was already in touch with the English-speaking world. All the same, he was serving in the Austrian army. And this decision to give away everything, I think, can also be traced in this America book by Stanley Cavell. In the third part of the book, Finding as Founding, where he speaks about Emerson's essay, Experience. And I think tries to tell us that to discover this unapproachable country, you have to let go. You probably know the essay much better than I do. The Experience essay, which the experience which Emerson is writing about is the experience of the loss of his child. But he is speaking about this loss of a very close person in terms of a new country, which can only be discovered by giving, in fact, giving birth or losing. And he that's what Cavell, I think, is trying to describe. He is describing giving in terms of loss. To describe this concept of unapproachability. What you give, you cannot approach. This giving I sense in Wittgenstein as well, on a different level. So I don't know how much time we have. Should we have a brief look at the Zilan, or do that tomorrow? I have no idea what time it is.
It's 5:30.
Oh, there's a what?
Yeah. We could do about 10 minutes of reading a poem. And then
Maybe
stop.
just to look at the letters
Yeah.
and the sounds. We needn't discuss the poem
Are you
extensively,
game
but
for some salon? Yes? Let's.
I wanted to say that the group that left is a part of the Woodberry Poetry translation group, and they went over to the poetry room to translate, so it's just their Monday meetings. They wanted me to apologize.
Let's do a little salon.
Yeah, let's.
because
Can we pass it out?
What?
In 10 minutes?
We will probably only do one word, you know?
Okay. Should I pass it out?
yes, let me maybe think about what. Yes, there is one word we could actually think about.
It's just that not everyone will be able to return tomorrow, so it might be nice to show them something.
Yes, I have made photocopies of a Bernstein poem, which we'll be looking at tomorrow or on one of the next days, which is the poem Johnny Cake Hollow. Actually, this poem, Johnny Cake Hollow, got the whole project going. It was the first poem which I read by Charles Bernstein some years ago. It was introduced by an American student who is part of the VERSATORIUM group. And we had been talking about Hölderlin poems, and she wanted to do a presentation, and she was quite afraid to talk about this Johnny Cake Hollow poem after Hölderlin. And then she did present the poem, and we talked about this little Johnny Cake Hollow poem, which may not mean anything, this poem. We talked about for weeks and weeks, probably the whole semester, and we made about 20 translations of it, although it has no meaning, and it's the beginning of this book. Maybe before we switch to Zilan, maybe to give you an idea of this book, it starts with a poem where it's hard to decide whether you're reading an original or not. You're reading a poem. You don't know much more than you're reading a poem. If you continue to turn the pages, you will realize that retranslations come as you proceed, and eventually, right in between the translations, the Bernstein poem appears, only marked by two little letters, alphabetically marked as CB. So you come across CB, but you also come across JW or PW or JR and so on. Some readers will not realize what these little, some will find they are a nuisance or a kind of non-information. If you look into the back of the book, you will find CBs are letters, abbreviations of the names. So CB in that case is Charles Bernstein. He's hiding unapproachably, hopefully, in between all these translations. So I brought the Johnny Cake Hollow, and we can look at that tomorrow or on one of the other days. And I also made photocopies of. So here we have translations we produced. but here is a translation which Charles Bernstein made of Paul Celan's poem Tod-Nauberg. And maybe this is an example of a translation which does not aim at reproducing meaning, but doing something else, which is quite hard to describe what it is doing. So maybe you'd like to take a few. I have a meaningful translation as well, if you're interested, which was done by the English, again, bilingual poet Michael Hamburger.
We didn't finish the project, by the way.
Sorry?
It's an incomplete translation also. And he explained that he didn't want to finish the project because he didn't know enough about Paul Celan to finish
All right.
the translation.
Yes.
So it's an interesting
Yeah.
combination.
So here is the just check. Here is the Celan original and the Hamburger translation. And then comes the translation which Bernstein produced.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you want
Okay, I'll pass it around this way. Shall I read the German and maybe also read the Bernstein translation to make it more German sounding, maybe?
Here's the German.
Mhm. The title of the poem is the name of a place in southern Germany. Tottenau is a village or small town. And Tottenauberg is a hill very close to that town. And in the title, Tottenauberg, you can hear all kinds of meanings or all kinds of elements, especially the word tot, which means death or dead. So I think if you don't understand German, this is a good opportunity to sort of leave out meaning. If you do understand German, then you're unlucky. So I'm unlucky, for instance. I understand too much, or I am under the impression that I understand. Too much under the impression that I understand. Tottenauberg after Paul. No, that's the. I will start with the German. Tottenauberg. Arnika, Augentrost, der Trunk aus dem Brunnen mit dem Sternwürfel drauf. In der Hütte, die in das Buch, wessen Namen nahm's auf, vor dem meinen. Die in dies Buch geschriebene Zeile von einer Hoffnung heute auf eines Denkenden kommendes Wort im Herzen. Waldvasen, uneingeebnet, Orchis und Orchis einzeln. Krudes später im Fahren, deutlich. Der uns fährt, der Mensch, der es mit anhört, die halb beschrittenen Knüppelpfade im Hochmoor, feuchtes, viel. So in the Bernstein translation, you have to make a few decisions how you want to pronounce certain words. For instance, in the first line, the last word of the line could be tear. It could also be tear. I don't know how to decide it. If you listen to the German, it's the German word in this position is der. So this could indicate that you should read it as tear, as the verb tear, or at least with this meaning of tearing something apart. And I think there's some other words as well which don't decide for you how to read them. Totnauberg after Paul Celan. Arnica, hold in trust. Tear. Trump out, dim, bruise, admit, dim, stern, waffled, drought. Indigo, hot. Die in that bush. Lesson naming nouns off, where dim minds men. Die in Die's book. Gusts, ribbons fail one. I'm an huff nun. Hurt, oath, I'm a Duncan, den, commends, what, in heart's end. World-wizened, uneyed and bent, arc is, unarc is, eyes realm. Crude, spatter in Führer, deutsche Leid. Tears, a fog, der, Mensch, dares admit ab ort. Die halved, beschmuddelt, cudgel, fade in hock's moor, folded, veil. In the middle, Deutsche Leid, that can be pronounced quite German, Deutsche Leid, meaning German folks, German people. Leid, L-E-I-T, a dialect version of Leute, people. Deutsche Leid. So we are actually thinking about how to, or whether this version of which this Bernstein version could be translated again. And we've been discussing this question again for weeks with not a single word translated yet. Completely resultless.
It sounds like a homophonic translation.
Yes.
You think he's doing several things. I mean, it's a homophonic, a phonetic translation, but it's also a graphic translation. He's doing both things. So he's actually using two different rules, and they're sort of competing with each other because the way you read it, it's die in that bush, but you know the German is
Yeah.
D.
Yeah.
So that's actually a graphic translation, it's
Yes.
not homophonic. And since you have two rules, obviously it's going to be very hard to translate it back into German. Because it depends on which rule
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
choose.
Mm.
Although classic homophonic translation is based on ignorance of how the language sounds when a speaker of that language speaks it, it does look at the graphic, at what's on the page, and then translates those sounds into the sort of phonetic rules of whatever your own language is. Right?
Yeah, the conventional
Yeah.
homophonic.
But you're right very much, though, that especially because he puts these words in German into his text.
Yeah.
And also your example of Deutschland does that as well. So he is playing on the sounds of the German language too, to put mention to it.
I was reading the German as maybe even a Yiddish and a Charles
Mm.
Bernstein,
Yeah.
Mensch, beschmudelt, kudgel.
Yeah.
Like a
Yes.
recuperation of the Yiddish.
Yes.
Mm.
Which one? This is the Bernstein.
The poem was written, I think, in 1967, a few days after Paul Celan visited the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who lived there on this hill, Tottenauberg. He owned a hut, maybe the hut mentioned in, or very probably the hut mentioned in the poem. And I was puzzled by this, by the German word Sternwürfel. So I Googled the word. I wasn't sure whether such a thing as a Sternwürfel, a star dice, exists. And if you Google the word Sternwürfel, you get various photographs, images of a Sternwürfel, and one of the first images you get is the Sternwürfel on a fountain in the garden of Martin Heidegger, and you see Martin Heidegger standing beside it with a bucket, with a white bucket in his hand, and on top of that, it's not really a fountain; it's a, I think you would call it a well. On top of that well is this Sternwürfel, an object in the shape of a star, but at the same time in the shape of a dice or a die. Michael Hamburger translates it as a die. And in this case, Bernstein translates, well, maybe in a homophonic way, Sternwürfel, to, well, what? To produce a completely different meaning. In this American version, you suddenly have not water and a well, but you have a drought.
Why didn't he translate the title?
Why he didn't?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Maybe we should try to translate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did you ask him?
No, I hardly ask any questions because
You don't want to approach him.
I don't want to approach him, and I like to sustain my confusion and all the ideas I have. If he gives me a certain sort of authorized version, I think that it won't satisfy me, I assume. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Well, Obviously, there's a lot to be said about the poem, but we can keep that for one of the other days, I suggest.
We maybe should leave you in peace. You've flown in yesterday, and it's here. It's been a long time.
But if you have questions, I'd be
yes.
happy to answer them or think about them. I don't think I can answer any, probably.
Hearing you talk about what you do as a group at VERSATORIUM and looking at this book, and hearing you talk about resultless
Yeah.
efforts and non-approachability, I mean, it seems to me like there's a different notion of productivity at work. That
Yeah.
productivity isn't defined by an authoritative final translation, but by the generation of conflicting translations that remain of necessity provisional. And I think that, I don't know if that's an accurate assessment, but if it is, it sounds very exciting to me.
Actually, the group is very productive. I forgot to talk about all the activities. It seems as if I am sort of responsible for VERSATORIUM, or as if I am representing VERSATORIUM, but I'm not. It's a group of, I don't even know how many participants, sometimes 12 to 15, sometimes more. At the moment, we have this Stanley Cavell seminar going on, and I've attracted about 30 students. Actually, there's a lot happening without necessarily producing results, but producing activity. For instance, I can give you a few examples. I have to look into my notes because so much is going on. It's more or less out of control, what we are doing. The main subject is language poetry. That's what we started with, and this is the center of attraction. But around this investigation of what is happening, has happened, and is happening in the field of language poetry, other activities have developed. One is, as you mentioned, a group learning the Georgian language. For me, this is quite surprising because I had never intended this. But there is one member of the VERSATORIUM group from Tbilisi, and after a while she suggested to the student group, or asked whether anybody would be interested in learning Georgian. No, in Austria you cannot learn Georgian anywhere, not at the University of Vienna or anywhere else. And 12 students became interested, and they've been learning Georgian now for 7 or 8 months. There's one, they're all very talented, and there's one young woman in this group who writes poetry, and she's now writing poems in Georgian. Still, I think, quite simple, but it's very difficult to write in Georgian. Has a very beautiful, strange alphabet and a non-European grammar. I think that's the attraction for the students, to be able to learn a language which is quite close to Europe. It's not very far from Austria. It's 2.5 hours by aeroplane. But the language has no connection to any European language, no connection to Russian, not at all, apart from words they've imported from Russian. But grammatically, it has no connection at all. There's no relation between the two languages. No relation to Turkish, to Armenian, to Azeri, Azerbaijan. Very little, some influence, but only words, nothing as to grammar. Some influence from Iran. It's a completely individual language. It's one of the 25 basic languages of the world, but it's spoken only by 3.5 million people. And 1.5 are now not living in Georgia. So in Georgia, now there are only about 2 million speakers of that language, and it's one of the very old languages. So there's a group learning Georgian, and this group discovered an avant-garde poetry movement in Tbilisi in the 1920s. And they're translating visual poems produced by this group called H2SO4, sulfuric acid. We scanned the poetry of this H2SO4 group when we went to Tbilisi. We have, I think, 50 visual poems, and they're gradually trying to translate these poems. At the same time, learning the language. That's an interesting concept, learning a language through poetry. One group is translating a poem by Blaise Cendrars. The title in English is something like The Prose of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Another group is translating an Italian dialect poet, Roberta da Punt. A small group is translating 2 cantos from the Divina Commedia. There's a group translating a theater play by Elfriede Jelinek. In 2013, she wrote a play for and about the refugees who were protesting in Vienna against the Austrian asylum politics and who had occupied a church in the center of Vienna. I was one of the supporters of that protest, among many, many other supporters, and introduced the students to this protest movement. And then we realized that Elfriede Jelinek was also observing what this protest group was doing. And I suggested to the students and to some of the refugees we should try to translate the theater play into the languages of the people doing the protest. So now we've started to translate the play into English, and in 2 weeks' time we will meet with people from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia and Nigeria to translate parts of the theater play into the individual languages for the refugees to understand what Elfriede Jelinek is writing about. Because she's writing in a first-person plural form. First sentence is, we are alive. We are still alive. And this we is the group of Pakistani protesters in the church in Vienna in 2013. So we'd like these Pakistani people who've come to Austria to know who is speaking in their name. That's the project. And a few weeks ago, suddenly I realized that among this group of students there are many writers who have been very shy about their writing so far, but now they've established a writing group where they read the poems and discuss their poetry. I haven't been to that group yet. And we're also translating Shakespeare's Coriolanus into a homophonic version. So you see, it's sort of out of control.
In the best sense.
Yeah, in the best sense.
Do you have any groups working on Asian languages, East Asian languages? Chinese, Korean, and Japanese?
Sorry, which languages?
Chinese, Japanese, or Korean?
No, not at all. But it will happen.
Yes.
Sure.
Well, we should stop and we will pick up tomorrow at 5 o'clock. For those of you who can come, and if you have friends or people who will be interested, know that this is very fluid, so people can come and go as
Probably much more close reading. And
Yes.
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 And there'll be some group translation
There'll be a
activities
poetry
too.
room retreats.
Right, so 3rd floor of Lamont, Woodberry Poetry Room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.